7:17 in the morning, October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar in the central Philippines, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston and saw something no American naval officer was ever supposed to see that day. 4 Japanese battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and rising above the northern horizon, the pagoda mast of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. 18 miles away and closing at 30 knots. No one was supposed to be here, not the Japanese, not Yamato. Not the pagoda masts of the entire center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, in open water, 20 miles from the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, with nothing between them and the transports except 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The man responsible for this moment was 3,000 miles away, sitting in a stucco headquarters at Pearl Harbor. His name was Chester Nimitz. And 3 months earlier, in a beachfront mansion on Waikiki, he had said no to Douglas MacArthur. He had said it 4 times, over 3 years. And this off Samar at 7:17 in the morning was the price. To understand how the price came due, you have to go back. Back to a cruiser in Pearl Harbor, back to a mud bank in the Philippines, back to a general who wanted the fleet, and an admiral who would not give it to him. Pearl Harbor, July 26, 1944. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore sat at anchor in the sun-bleached harbor, her grey steel radiating the heat of the Hawaiian afternoon. On her quarterdeck, 3 of the most powerful men on Earth were about to sit down together for the first time in their lives. A president who could not stand without help, a general who believed he was destined to be president, and an admiral who believed nothing at all about destiny, only about hydrography, fuel tonnage, and the cold mathematics of what a Pacific Ocean measuring 64 million square miles would allow a fleet to do. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 62 years old, was wheeled onto the deck first. The president had traveled by rail across the American continent, then by cruiser across 2,000 miles of Pacific, to hold a meeting he did not want to hold, with 2 men who did not want to meet each other. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, 59 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, stood already at attention, slate-grey hair, quiet blue eyes, a face that gave away nothing. He had been a Texas farm boy who once ran a destroyer aground and nearly ended his career at the age of 23. Now he commanded more warships than the entire Royal Navy. The last to arrive was General Douglas MacArthur. He came by open automobile, sirens leading him through the streets of Honolulu. He waved to the crowds that had gathered. He wore a leather flight jacket in 90-degree heat. He arrived exactly late enough for everyone to notice. MacArthur was 64 years old. He was the son of a Medal of Honor winner. He had graduated first in his class at West Point. He was a general when Nimitz was still a captain, and he had spent the last 4 months in secret, campaigning to unseat the man he was now walking on deck to salute. 3 men, 3 uniforms, 1 ocean, and behind them, invisible in the harbor haze, the war they were supposed to be winning. 2.5 years earlier, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, this same harbor had burned. Nimitz had not been here to see it. He had been in Washington, running the Navy's Bureau of Navigation, a desk job. The commander who had been here, Admiral Husband Kimmel, was dismissed within days. 10 days after the attack, Roosevelt made his choice. He asked Frank Knox, his Secretary of the Navy, for a list of the most competent flag officers in the fleet. A committee of 9 senior admirals reviewed 120 names. Nimitz's name emerged not as a bold pick, not as a fighter's pick, but as a manager's pick. A man who had spent much of his career fixing broken things, fixing broken ships, fixing broken careers, fixing broken systems. Roosevelt sent him west with a single sentence: get out to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won. Nimitz raised his flag on December 31st, 1941, aboard the submarine USS Grayling. The battleships that were supposed to be his flagships were on the bottom of the harbor. It was, in retrospect, a strangely fitting beginning for a man whose first command had ended in disaster. July 7th, 1908, Batangas Bay in the Philippines. Ensign Nimitz, 23 years old, commanded the destroyer USS Decatur. The charts of the harbor were unreliable. The tide tables were sitting on his desk. He did not check them. He estimated his position, and at 8:50 in the morning, His leadsman called out that the ship was no longer moving. Decatur was aground on a mudbank. A court-martial convened on the cruiser USS Denver. He was found guilty of neglect of duty. He was publicly reprimanded. He was relieved of his command, and he was reassigned to the one place in the Navy that nobody wanted to go, the submarine service. That grounding should have ended his career. Instead, it defined the rest of it. Every decision he ever made from that day forward would be marked by an obsession with the details other men skipped. He would check the tide tables. He would read the charts. He would ask the leadsman. And on July 26, 1944, standing on the deck of USS Baltimore, he was about to face a man who had made his career doing precisely the opposite. Douglas MacArthur checked no charts. He read no tide tables. He estimated everything. The Philippines had been MacArthur's kingdom before it was his prison. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had been the military governor of the islands after the Spanish-American War. Douglas had grown up hearing that name, Manila. Corregidor, Bataan. When he took command of United States Army forces in the Far East in July of 1941, he was returning to a place that felt like inheritance. Then Pearl Harbor burned. 10 hours after the attack on Hawaii, 10 full hours during which he had been notified of the Pearl Harbor attack and repeatedly urged by his air commander, Major General Louis Brereton, to authorize a preemptive strike against Japanese airfields on Formosa. Japanese bombers appeared over Clark Field in the Philippines. MacArthur's aircraft were still parked wingtip to wingtip on the runway. In a single afternoon, the Japanese destroyed 12 of the 17 T-scene flying fortresses at Clark Field and more than 30 P-40 fighters at Clark and at nearby Iba Field. The best chance the Philippines had of surviving the coming invasion was gone. MacArthur was never asked to explain it. Not by Roosevelt, not by Marshall, not by Congress. In a war that would produce endless investigations of every subordinate failure, this catastrophic one, under the command of a 4-star general, was quietly buried. By March of 1942, the Japanese had driven MacArthur's forces onto the Bataan Peninsula and the fortress island of Corregidor in Manila Bay. Roosevelt ordered him out. There were too many risks in leaving America's most famous general to be captured by the enemy. On the night of March 11, 1942, at 7:45 in the evening, 4 patrol torpedo boats slipped out of Corregidor's North Dock. MacArthur, his wife Jean, his 4-year-old son Arthur, and a party of officers rowed in PT-41, commanded by a 30-year-old Navy lieutenant named John Duncan Bulkley. Bulkley had been fighting a private naval war in Philippine waters for 4 months, with worn engines, no spare parts, and boats held together by improvised repairs. The seas that night reached 12-foot swells. Japanese warships patrolled the passages, and 32 of Bulkley's sailors were left behind on Bataan to serve as infantry, so that MacArthur's staff could take their seats. 35 hours later, PT-41 delivered MacArthur to Mindanao. From there, a B-17 flew him to Australia. On March 20, 1942, at a small railway station called Terawi in South Australia, MacArthur stepped off the train and spoke the 8 words that would define the rest of his war. "I came through and I shall return." He did not say we, he said I. 2 of every 3 men he had left behind on Bataan would die before he returned. In late March of 1942, the combined chiefs of staff in Washington drew a line across the Pacific Ocean. Everything west of a longitude of 159 degrees east belonged to MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. Everything east belonged to Nimitz's Pacific Ocean areas. 2 theaters, 2 commanders, 1 enemy, no unified command. The historian Ronald Spector, writing decades later, would call it the most unexplainable decision of the Pacific War. But the reason for it was hiding in plain sight. And here is the first twist of this story, one that undermines every clean narrative that has ever been told about the strategy of the Pacific. The Pacific was divided in 2, not because it was the best way to fight the Japanese. It was divided in 2 because there was no way to put MacArthur and the Navy under the same roof. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, 63 years old at the time, was the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. Roosevelt had appointed him because the Navy needed a fighter. King was that. He was also, by nearly every account of everyone who worked with him, one of the most unpleasant human beings in the American armed forces. His own daughter said her father was the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He was always in a rage. Roosevelt famously said that King shaved every morning with a blowtorch. King had a private list of things he refused to permit. Near the top of that list was the idea of Douglas MacArthur commanding a single United States warship. King would sooner have resigned than allow it. MacArthur, for his part, had made it equally clear. He would not accept command under a naval officer. He was senior in rank to every admiral in the Pacific. He was the highest-ranking officer of the American Army. He believed, and said openly, that the Navy was trying to make itself the premier service of the American military, and that he was the last obstacle standing in its way. Marshall tried to broker a compromise. There was no compromise available. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff did the only thing they could do. They cut the ocean in half. That decision, made not by strategists, but by two men refusing to sit at the same table, would shape every operation for the next 3.5 years. It would cost lives at Tarawa and at Peleliu. It would nearly cost the entire invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. And it would, in ways that no one at the time could have predicted, defeat the Empire of Japan. But that was still years away. In the spring of 1944, another twist was working its way through the private mail of the Republican Party. Douglas MacArthur, while commanding an active theater of war, had been quietly courting the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States. His backers in Congress, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, Representative Hamilton Fish, and others, believed he could unseat Roosevelt in November. MacArthur had exchanged letters with a Nebraska congressman named A.L. Miller, in which he agreed with Miller's dark assessment of Roosevelt's leadership and the direction of the country. Miller released the letters to the public in April of 1944. The reaction was catastrophic. A serving general, in the middle of the largest war in human history, had been caught corresponding privately with a partisan congressman about the political failings of his commander-in-chief. On April 30, 1944, MacArthur issued a statement asking that his name be removed from consideration. He did not covet the nomination, he said. He would not accept it. 3 months later, he stepped onto the deck of USS Baltimore in Pearl Harbor to shake the hand of the president he had just tried to unseat. And Franklin Roosevelt, who missed nothing, shook his hand back. The private dinner that night was held at the beachfront mansion of a Honolulu millionaire named Chris Holmes. Cream stucco walls, a view of the Waikiki surf, MacArthur, Nimitz and the president alone at the table. The maps came out after the coffee. MacArthur wanted the Philippines. He wanted every ship, every carrier, every landing craft, every gallon of fuel that the United States Navy could give him. He wanted operational control of the fast carrier task forces. He wanted the amphibious shipping. He wanted the logistics fleet. He wanted, in effect, the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz wanted Formosa. And between them sat a president who understood something neither general nor admiral had yet understood. He was going to give MacArthur his target, and he was going to make sure Nimitz kept the fleet. Long before Pearl Harbor, before Baltimore, before the mansion on Waikiki, the refusals had already begun. The first came in the summer of 1942. The Japanese Navy had built an airfield on a jungle island in the southern Solomons called Guadalcanal. The airfield threatened the shipping lanes between the United States and Australia. Something had to be done about it, and when the plan for an amphibious assault landed on King's desk, MacArthur wrote to Washington demanding that the operation be placed under his command. King refused. Guadalcanal lay in Nimitz's South Pacific area. It would be a Navy operation led by a Navy admiral, using Navy transports and Marine landing forces. King sent Vice Admiral Robert Gormley to command it. MacArthur was informed. MacArthur objected. The objection was noted and set aside. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division waded ashore on Guadalcanal. The battle that followed lasted 6 months. It cost the Navy 4 heavy cruisers in a single night off Savo Island. It nearly bankrupted the American aircraft carrier fleet. But it was fought and won under naval command, and MacArthur was not part of it. That was refusal number 1. Refusal number 2 came in May of 1943 at the Trident Conference in Washington. Roosevelt, Churchill, and their military chiefs of staff sat down to decide the shape of the war for the year to come. King argued, forcefully, that the shortest road to Tokyo ran through the Central Pacific, through the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, straight west toward Japan. MacArthur wanted the priority. He did not get it. The conference approved a twin-axis strategy, Nimitz in the center, MacArthur in the southwest, with priority given to the center. MacArthur would continue his advance up the coast of New Guinea, but the main effort, the main fleet, the main air strength, would flow through Nimitz. MacArthur wrote to Marshall. He called the decision a betrayal of the men who had died on Bataan. He said the Navy was preparing to leave his forces to wither on the New Guinea vine while the fleet won the war. The decision stood. That was refusal number 2. By the end of 1943, Nimitz's central drive was moving. In November, the 2nd Marine Division landed on a coral atoll called Tarawa. 3 days of fighting, 3,000 American casualties on a piece of land smaller than Central Park. The lesson was bloody, but the lesson held. Amphibious assault against a fortified atoll was possible. The technique could be refined. By February of 1944, the refined technique landed in the Marshall Islands. Kwajalein fell in a week, at a fraction of Tarawa's cost. In the same month, carriers under Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitchell, 57 years old, struck the Japanese fleet base at Truk in the Carolines. Truk had been called the Pearl Harbor of Japan. 2 days of American air attack reduced it to a graveyard of merchant hulks and beached destroyers. Meanwhile, MacArthur was doing something remarkable on the other side of the Pacific. He had adopted the very strategy he had once denounced. Since the summer of 1943, Southwest Pacific forces had been executing Operation Cartwheel, the plan to encircle the massive Japanese base at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. Cartwheel involved a series of coordinated leaps using naval air, land-based air, and army landings to isolate Rabaul rather than assault it. MacArthur had initially opposed the bypass. He had wanted to storm Rabaul directly. When the Joint Chiefs overruled him and ordered isolation instead, he objected, and then, over months of successful operations, quietly reversed himself. By April of 1944, when his forces made a 600-mile leap over 40,000 Japanese troops at Wewak to land at Hollandia on the northern coast of New Guinea, MacArthur was the loudest advocate of bypass strategy in the entire American war effort. The Hollandia landing succeeded partly because Nimitz loaned him 3 fast carrier task groups from the 5th Fleet under Mitchell. MacArthur said thank you and immediately began asking for more. The third refusal was more subtle. It happened in a room at MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, in late March of 1944. Nimitz had flown south for a personal meeting. The 2 commanders needed to coordinate. The Joint Chiefs had issued a directive on strategy, and MacArthur had objections. Nimitz brought his best staff officers. He came in good faith, prepared to hear MacArthur out. For most of the conference, the 2 men agreed. Nimitz was surprised. He had expected a fight. Instead, MacArthur listened, nodded, and seemed to accept the direction of the war. And then, on the last day, MacArthur reversed himself. He announced that he could not accept the plan, that the Navy's Central Pacific drive was strategically wrong-headed, that the Philippines had to be the priority, and that the Navy would be foolish to bypass them. Nimitz sat and listened. He said very little. He returned to Pearl Harbor and wrote a private report to King describing what had happened. Everything was lovely and harmonious, Nimitz wrote, until the last day of our conference. That report went into King's files. It would be remembered. Refusal number 3 had not yet been issued, but the ground had been prepared. In the meantime, on June 19th and 20th of 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy came out to fight one last carrier battle. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa brought 9 carriers and 430 aircraft. Vice Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, 57 years old, commander of the 5th Fleet, met him with 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft. American radar tracked the Japanese formations from more than 100 miles out. American Hellcats, flown by pilots with a year of combat experience, met Japanese air crews whose training programs had been shortened to weeks. By the evening of the 20th of June, Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers and nearly 600 aircraft. 445 pilots and aircrew had been killed. A young Hellcat pilot named Ziggy Neff climbing from his cockpit, drawled that it had been just like an old-fashioned turkey shoot back home. The name stuck. The battle would forever be the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But something else had happened too, something that would matter later. Spruance had refused to chase. He could have, he had the speed, he had the fuel, his pilots wanted him to. His subordinate Mitcher had recommended it. But Spruance had one job, protect the amphibious landings on Saipan, and he would not leave that job undone to pursue a beaten enemy. Some naval officers criticized him for it at the time. King himself was privately displeased, but Spruance was Nimitz's man, and Nimitz backed him. Here is the second half of the twist that most retellings miss. At the same moment that Nimitz was fighting off MacArthur's demand for the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz was fighting a private disagreement inside his own navy. King and Nimitz wanted Formosa. Spruance did not. Spruance believed that Formosa was too heavily garrisoned, too distant from American air support, and too costly to seize. He preferred Iwo Jima and Okinawa as stepping stones toward Japan. The Navy was not the monolith MacArthur believed it to be. Nimitz's own most successful fleet commander was quietly working against the Navy's own preferred plan. By the time Roosevelt's cruiser dropped anchor in Pearl Harbor on July 26, 1944, the strategic problem had grown teeth. The Baltimore Conference lasted 2 days. The first afternoon was for photographs. MacArthur seated between Roosevelt and Nimitz, the three of them staring at a wall map of the Pacific. The evening was for the private dinner at the Chris Holmes mansion. The second day was for the strategic argument. MacArthur spoke first. He spoke for hours. The Philippines were the moral heart of the American war. Millions of Filipinos, promised liberation, were suffering under Japanese occupation. 300,000 American and Filipino soldiers had died or been imprisoned there. To bypass them, to leave them to rot, would be an act of national dishonor that no American president could survive. Then he made the argument that reached Roosevelt directly. Mr. President, if you leave the Filipinos in bondage, the American people will not forgive you. Nimitz spoke second. He spoke for less than an hour. Formosa was closer to Japan. Formosa cut the Japanese supply line from the Dutch East Indies. Formosa opened the door to the coast of China. The Philippines, Nimitz argued, could be bypassed. The Japanese garrisons there could be starved. The main effort should drive northwest, through Formosa, straight at the throat of the empire. Roosevelt listened. He asked questions. He complimented both men. He made no decision. MacArthur left Pearl Harbor believing he had won. Nimitz left believing that nothing had been decided. Both were partly right. On October 3, 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued their formal directive. The Philippines would be invaded. MacArthur would command the ground operation. The target would be Leyte in the central Philippines, and the timetable was pushed forward, at MacArthur's request, through Halsey, from December to October 20th. MacArthur read the message and celebrated. He had his Philippines, but he did not have the fleet. Here is the deepest twist of the entire story, the one that gives this whole affair its meaning. The Joint Chiefs had chosen MacArthur's objective, but they had refused MacArthur's command structure. The invasion of Leyte would be executed with 2 separate fleets. Vice Admiral Thomas Cassin Kinkaid, 56 years old, would command the 7th Fleet directly under MacArthur, the amphibious force, the escort carriers, the fire support ships. And Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr., 61 years old, would command the 3rd Fleet under Nimitz, the fast battleships, the fleet carriers, the striking arm of the Pacific. 2 chains of command, 1 battlefield. Nimitz had refused. He had refused not by making a speech, not by writing a memorandum, not by resigning in protest. He had refused by holding his ground for 2.5 years, through 4 separate contests, over 4 separate operations, until the moment came when Roosevelt had to choose, and Roosevelt chose the compromise. Give MacArthur the mission, keep the fleet under the Navy. That refusal was about to be tested in the worst possible way. The Japanese plan for the defense of the Philippines was called Shugo, or Victory Operation. It was a suicidal plan, built around a diminishing fleet and a shortage of trained pilots. The Japanese would use their remaining aircraft carriers, nearly empty of aircraft, as bait. They would draw the American fleet north, away from the invasion beaches. And they would send 3 surface forces, packed with battleships and heavy cruisers, through the narrow straits of the central Philippines to fall upon the American transports at Leyte Gulf and destroy them. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, 55 years old, commanded the strongest of these surface forces. 32 warships, including the two largest battleships ever built, Yamato and Musashi, steamed east toward the Cebuisan Sea, and beyond it, the San Bernardino Strait. On October 24, 1904, Halsey's carrier aircraft caught Kurita's force in the Cebuisan Sea. Waves of American bombers and torpedo planes struck the same target, over and over, the super battleship Musashi. She absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before capsizing that afternoon. It was a spectacular kill. It was also a mistake. Halsey's pilots, elated, reported that they had crippled the entire center force. Halsey believed them. He believed that Kurita, with Musashi gone, would turn back. Kurita did turn away, briefly, to nurse his damaged ships. Then, under direct pressure from Combined Fleet Headquarters, he turned east again and drove for the San Bernardino Strait at full speed. Late that same afternoon, American search aircraft found Ozawa's decoy carriers steaming down from the north. Halsey had a decision to make. He could split his force. He could leave a task group of fast battleships, Task Force 34 under Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, to guard the mouth of San Bernardino Strait and take his 3 carrier groups north to attack Ozawa. He did not split his force. At 7:50 in the evening of October 24th, Halsey ordered the entire Third Fleet, every carrier, every battleship, every escort, to steam north at 16 knots to engage Ozawa's carriers. Nothing was left to guard San Bernardino Strait. Not a battleship, not a cruiser, not a single American destroyer. The back door to the Leyte beachhead stood open. Kincaid, aboard his flagship in Leyte Gulf, listened to the radio traffic and misread it. He believed that Task Force 34 was being formed to cover the strait. He believed the strait was guarded. He was wrong. At 35 minutes past midnight on October 25th, Kurita's center force completed the transit of San Bernardino Strait. He steamed into the open Pacific and turned south along the coast of Samar. Ahead of him, unaware and undefended, lay the American invasion fleet. In the American slang that would follow, Halsey's charge north would be called Bull's Run. It was named after Halsey's newspaper nickname and after the disastrous Confederate victory of 1861. It was not a compliment. Aboard Halsey's flagship, USS New Jersey, watch officers received disturbing reports through the night. A night reconnaissance aircraft from the light carrier USS Independence tracked Kurita's force through the strait. The report reached the flag bridge and was, in the confused language of after-action reports, effectively ignored. Aboard USS Lexington, Commander R. Lee Burke and Commander James Flatley were sufficiently alarmed to wake Vice Admiral Mitchell and show him the report. Mitchell asked whether Halsey had seen it. When told that he had, Mitchell lay back down and went to sleep. It was not Mitchell's fleet. Vice Admiral Lee, commander of the battleships in Task Force 34, that had never been detached, also suspected a decoy. He sent his suspicions to New Jersey. They were noted and set aside. At 6:45 on the morning of October 25th, radar operators aboard the escort carriers of Taffy 3, off the coast of Samar, picked up a formation of surface warships closing at high speed from the north-northwest. The war in the Pacific had reached its worst possible moment. At Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles to the east, Admiral Nimitz sat in his headquarters and watched the situation reports come in. Kincaid's 7th Fleet had radioed a plain language plea for help. Halsey's 3rd Fleet was 100 miles north and moving away. There was no unified commander at Leyte. There was no one to give the order that had to be given. Nimitz commanded Halsey but did not command Kincaid. MacArthur commanded Kincaid but did not command Halsey, and no one commanded MacArthur except the President, who was in Hyde Park. At 9:44 in the morning, Nimitz picked up a message pad. He wrote 7 words. "Where is repeat? Where is Task Force 34? He handed the pad to his communications yeoman. The yeoman, following standard procedure, added padding phrases at the front and back of the message to confuse Japanese cryptanalysis. The rules were clear. The padding must not read as part of the message. The yeoman, whose mind wandered for a moment, chose a phrase paraphrased from Tennyson's poem about the charge of the Light Brigade. The full transmit message read, Turkey trots to water, from SeaTac, Action Commander 3rd Fleet. Info SOMINCH, CTF 77. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. The double consonants were supposed to mark the padding. They failed to. On the bridge of USS New Jersey, Halsey opened the decoded message and read, Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. He believed his commanding officer had just publicly humiliated him. He tore the cap from his head. He threw it on the deck. Rear Admiral Robert Bostwick Carney, his chief of staff, spoke to him in the sharpest language he had ever used with his old friend. Halsey stood shaking. He was less than 50 miles from the Japanese carrier force he had been hunting for 2 years. He had been about to sink it. He turned his battleship south. He would race back toward Leyte at flank speed. It was too late. Off the coast of Samar, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, a force built to hunt submarines, not to fight battleships, were about to meet the entire Japanese center force alone. 6:47 in the morning, October 25th, 1944, off the coast of Samar. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, 48 years old, commander of Taffy 3, stood on the flag bridge of the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay. His radar had just reported the surface contact. His lookouts were reporting pagoda masts on the northern horizon, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships. Sprague did not believe it at first. He had been told the strait was covered. He had been told the Japanese center force was retreating. He looked at the horizon and saw the impossible becoming visible. He gave the only orders he could give: launch every aircraft, make smoke, turn southeast to run, and to the small ships of his screen, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, he gave the order that would define the day. Attack. Aboard USS Johnston, DD 557, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans heard the order and did not wait for it. He was already turning north to close the range. Evans was 36 years old. He had been born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, on August 13, 1908. He was of Cherokee and Creek ancestry, born poor in a segregated state at a time when Native men in the American Navy were expected to remain enlisted men and stay there. Evans had graduated a nearly all-white high school. He had enlisted in the Navy at 17. He had won an appointment to Annapolis through fleet competition. His fellow midshipmen had called him Big Chief. He had graduated in 1931. He had fought at the Battle of the Java Sea in February of 1942. He had been aboard a destroyer that had watched the Allied fleet die under Japanese guns. He had been ordered to withdraw. He had never forgiven himself for that withdrawal. On October 27, 1943, at the commissioning of USS Johnston in Seattle, Washington, he had stood on the fantail and spoken to his crew. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. No one got off. Now, 1 year and 1 day after that speech, Evans stood on the bridge of Johnston and closed the range on Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. He was 1 Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,000 tons displacement, with 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. He fired all 10 torpedoes at the lead heavy cruiser Kumano. At least 1 struck home. Kumano's bow was blown off. She fell out of formation. American carrier aircraft would sink her exactly 1 month later in Dassel Bay, but her war ended at Samar. The first American ship to open fire on Kurita's fleet that morning was a 2,000-ton destroyer, whose captain had never been permitted to forget the Java Sea. Johnston paid for the torpedo hits within minutes. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck her superstructure, followed by 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser. Her aft engine room was destroyed. Her rear gun mounts went silent. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand and took shrapnel in his chest and neck. His shirt was torn away. He tied a handkerchief around the stump of his hand and continued to give orders. Behind him, USS Hole and USS Heerman joined the attack. The destroyer escorts USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler and USS Raymond followed. The commander of Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, spoke over his ship's loudspeaker to his crew. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. His men manned their guns. Samuel B. Roberts fired 608 rounds from her 2 5-inch guns, nearly her entire magazine, before she was sunk by shells from the battleship Congo. For 2 hours, Taffy 3 fought a battle that could not be won. Escort carrier pilots, launching aircraft loaded with the wrong bombs for surface targets, made dry strafing runs on Japanese battleships to distract them. Destroyers steamed directly at cruisers. Destroyer escorts fought battleships. USS Johnston, dead in the water, was surrounded by Japanese destroyers and pounded to pieces. She rolled over and sank just after 10 in the morning. Evans was seen by survivors giving orders in the water. He was not among those rescued. He was 36 years old. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Behind him, unbelievably, Taffy 3 was still afloat. 2 escort carriers had been sunk. 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort had gone down. Hundreds of American sailors were in the water, but the Japanese fleet had not broken through. And then, at 9:11 in the morning, Vice Admiral Kurita gave an order that has been debated for 80 years. He turned his ships north. Here is the twist that ends the entire naval story of the Pacific War. Kurita, on the verge of the greatest surface victory in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, with the American invasion fleet 20 miles away and undefended, voluntarily broke off his attack and withdrew. He had many reasons. He believed he was fighting the fast fleet carriers of Halsey's Third Fleet, not the tiny escort carriers of Taffy 3. He had lost cohesion in the chaos of the surprise engagement. His ships were scattered across 100 miles of ocean. His flagship suffered near misses. He was low on fuel. He was, by his own Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi's later admission, exhausted beyond the capacity to think clearly. And he feared that Halsey was closing in from the north. Halsey was not closing in from the north. Halsey was still hundreds of miles away, racing south at flank speed, arriving hours too late to do anything except take credit for a fight that other men had already won. Kurita's center force retired the way it had come. Yamato, the greatest battleship ever built, turned her back on the American transports and steamed away. The invasion fleet at Leyte was saved, not by American planning, not by American command structure, not by unified strategy. It was saved by the courage of Taffy 3 and by the confusion and exhaustion of a Japanese admiral who could not believe what he was actually seeing. The split command in the Pacific. The one Nimitz had fought to preserve, the one that had left San Bernardino Strait unguarded, the one that had nearly cost the invasion fleet, had produced a battle that should have been a catastrophe. And yet the Japanese had lost it. Because of Evans, because of Copeland, because of Sprague, because of 1,000 American sailors on ships that were never meant to fight battleships, who fought them anyway. The war ended 10 months later. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese delegation signed the instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. He spoke the closing words. He was photographed from every angle. His signature was the first on the American side. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood behind him. Nimitz signed second, in his capacity as representative of the United States. He said nothing memorable. He was photographed briefly. He returned to his quarters aboard his flagship without a word to the press. That was the shape of the rest of both their lives. MacArthur remained in Japan for 6 years as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He rewrote the Japanese constitution. He was recalled by President Truman in 1951 after publicly opposing his commander-in-chief over the conduct of the Korean War. He addressed a joint session of Congress in Washington and delivered the most famous speech of his life. "Old soldiers never die," he told them. "They just fade away." He did not fade away. He wrote his memoirs. He was courted again for the Republican presidential nomination. He never received it. He died in 1964 at Walter Reed General Hospital, aged 84. Nimitz returned home in December of 1945. He served 2 years as Chief of Naval Operations, then retired. He did not write his memoirs. He gave few interviews. He served quietly as a regent of the University of California. He lived his last years in a modest home at Quarters 1 on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay. He suffered a stroke in 1965. He died at his home on February 20th, 1966, aged 80. The verdict of history took time to catch up. Between 1945 and 1946, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogated hundreds of surviving Japanese officers. The naval interrogations, conducted at the former Naval War College at Hiyoshi, produced a documentary record of the war as seen from the other side. Senior Japanese officers were asked what had defeated them. Their answers, buried in the volumes of the USSBS interrogations, are a stranger tribute to Nimitz than any American historian ever wrote. The Japanese Naval General Staff, again and again, had guessed wrong about American intentions. They had fortified Rabaul. The Americans had bypassed Rabaul. They had reinforced Truk. The Americans had struck Truk once, then bypassed it. They had prepared for an assault on Formosa. The Americans had attacked the Philippines. They had believed the main effort would come from MacArthur through the southwest. It had come, in the end, from Nimitz through the center, and they had not been able to concentrate against either. They had faced two enemies moving independently. They could not identify the main effort because there was no main effort. There were two. The historian, Ronald Spector, examining these interrogations decades later, wrote that the dual advance across the Pacific was more a pragmatic solution to bureaucratic problems facing the Army and Navy than a strategic calculation. The twin-axis strategy had not been designed to defeat Japan. It had been designed to prevent MacArthur and King from resigning. And it had by accident become the perfect weapon. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by Act of Congress. He became the first Native American in the United States Navy ever to receive it, and one of only two destroyer captains in the Second World War to receive the medal at all. His body was never recovered. His name eventually returned to the fleet. In 2019, the Secretary of the Navy authorized the naming of a new Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, USS Ernest E. Evans, hull number DDG-137. She would carry his name into an ocean he had died to defend, 75 years after his ship had gone under. The refusals of Chester Nimitz did not save the Pacific War in the way that a battle saves a war. There was no single dramatic moment when he stood before the president and said no. He said no 4 times, in 4 rooms, over 3 years, quietly and firmly, until the compromise of split command became the strategy of the United States and could not be overturned. The compromise was ugly. It cost lives at Leyte Gulf. It nearly cost the invasion fleet at Samar. It required men like Ernest Evans to die making it work. But it worked. Because the Japanese, watching from Tokyo, could never figure out where the American blow was going to fall. A general and an admiral, an army and a navy, 2 fleets moving on different orders, through the same ocean. The Empire of Japan could not concentrate its dying strength against either one. Nimitz did not refuse to give MacArthur 80% of the Pacific Fleet, because he was jealous of MacArthur. He refused because he understood, as few men in Washington did, that the compromise the Joint Chiefs had stumbled into by accident in 1942 was better than any clean chain of command they could ever have designed on purpose. He was not a hero, he was a manager. He was a man who had once run a destroyer aground because he had not checked the tide tables. And when the war was won, he stood behind Douglas MacArthur on the deck of USS Missouri and let another man take the photograph. That was the shape of his victory. That was the shape of the peace.